Hey all, good to see you this morning. Happy New Year. Uh, just a heads up today. I going to do a little bit of this next kind of series from my office rather than home. Mostly because we just wiped out all of our Christmas decorations, and of course, there's just nothing as a backdrop. So this is going to have to do for a while. Let's see. The other thing that I got. Hey, good to see you, Ed Miller, John, Mark, everybody popping on board. It's awesome. Jeremy, good to have you. Happy New Year to everybody. I shouldn't say Happy New Year because I have to admit that at this early stage of the new year, 2021, I don't know about you, but certainly in my consciousness, I have not found any sense of resolve. I was talking to Lori and I was saying, I don't know that I really, I don't have a sense of how to orient yet in the new year. I am so discombobulated by global circumstances and national politics and all of the uh, kind of weight of revelation that has come to us via navigating this pandemic around race and equity and healthcare and economics and then the environmental thing in the looming in the background. I mean, just all this stuff. I just don't know how to get going into 2021. I want to get going. I suppose you do too. But I'm not completely convinced that I've got that figured out. And so um, that made this morning's preparation even more difficult, right? I don't really have anything to tell you. I wanted to bring some wisdom to you on 2021 and say, hey, let me help guide you into something beautiful as we launch into a new year. And I have to admit, I'm not completely convinced I've got that figured out. So maybe we'll just wander into this together. So glad you're here. Great to see everybody popping on board. I also wanted to say that on my way down to the office, I dropped the sign that says we're going to start at 9:30, and it fell into a puddle, and so it got destroyed. So there's that. So if you're just getting on board, we're just going. We're just starting. We're getting started. Uh, Barbara, good to see you. Tom, glad you're here. Hopefully, you got my email this morning about wayfinding. Georgia, good to have you this morning. Yeah, and I agree. We're all navigating this mess together. So let's do a little bit of that work, shall we? Um, I think I wanted to kind of start today, just because this isn't really just a reminder, right? This isn't like a church service. I committed early on that this would just be 30 to 45 minutes of like paying attention and paying attention with a heart linked to your spiritual life, our collective spiritual life, and then if there is some sense of a kind of a greater spirituality that holds us all, whether you frame that for yourself in a religious tradition or whether it's something more amorphous or different that you use to navigate all this, or whatever it happens to be, that should be a partner in the way in which we pay attention. In that vigorous attentiveness is really at the heart of the religious experience in my mind. And so this time together, just a reminder to everybody as we launch into the new year, is not me trying to pitch a particular religious perspective, even though I have one, but simply to invite us all into a moment of noticing, of tending to, of being present for each other, of sharing comments like you're doing, right? That just continue to um, allow layers of meaning and wisdom to find their way into each of our journeys. That's really what I want to do together on a time like this. And so to do so, I'm going to start with a piece of Zen poetry. But before I get there, I want to tell you why I didn't sleep last night. I think I didn't. I think I fell asleep about 6 a.m. this morning. Got maybe a couple hours of sleep. I don't know about you, but I am just tossing and turning, and that's not literally a metaphor. That's a real thing, right? I am tossing and turning in my inability to kind of wrap myself around all that's going on in the planet right now and in our culture, and and in this pandemic and all that we mentioned as we got started. And I can't, I can't get my arms around it. Very frustrating. I can't figure out like what's my way through this thing. I can't easily apply sort of traditional religious principles to think, hey, everything's going to be all right. This is part of God's plan. I'm not having any luck. I need luck. I'm not having any luck figuring this out. And I like to kind of have things sort of figured out so that I can engage the world in a meaningful way. Maybe you're the same way, but it's like I don't just want to be, rolling in the white water of this mess as the waves hit me over and over again. I want to be able to navigate the mess, and yet I can't seem to do it. And so subsequently, I know this is therapy, but just deal with me. Subsequently, I'm just spinning in my bed at night, mulling over my head all that's going on and finding myself getting more and more anxious or whatever it happens to be, right? So, Happy New Year. This is the mess I found myself in. So, where do we go from here? Well, so two things I want to do today is one, just think about why is it important, again, to just pause and have a moment like this every week. And I want to read this poem. It's a Zen poem, so it's all about Zen and not about Christianity or spirituality in the way you might frame it. But it helps from a perspective of a Zen poet to see what he's longing for in this piece of poetry. And I think it's something we're all longing for. So I want to start there and use that as a sort of our, isn't this awesome that we're all hanging out moment? Because we are all hanging out together. The second piece is I want to just explore for a moment, and it's only because, and I don't know, I'm not guaranteeing that this is a handle, but I want to explore the kind of the migration of what I would say the religious and spiritual traditions finding their way back to earth. And I'm just going to spend some time with that based on some references I made in other talks to an author called Don Cupid, who thinks about the most important thing for us to gather around now are not religious concepts that have kind of been our traditional way of knowing, but simply to immerse ourselves inside of the sacredness of life itself. That life now holds all that we are seeking. And he has a great way of framing that. And I'm wondering if maybe that might be a helpful tool, not only for me, but for you too, to think about or to run in parallel to your religious system, or to use as a way in which you seek meaning as we move into 2021. All right, so that's what we're going to do. All right, this is the piece of poetry. So take a moment, shall you? Take a moment. Be in a moment. And kind of get yourself into the mode of a Zen monk for a moment, right? So think about Zen monk trying to be totally present for world, and then writing this piece of poetry of what that Zen monk really longs for, and see if that resonates with you a little bit. So I just invite you to take a couple deep breaths. I will too, and then let's all be Zen for just a moment, shall we? And this comes from the Zen poetry of Ryokan called One Robe and One Bowl. Truly, I love this life of seclusion. Carrying my staff, I walk towards a friend's cottage. The trees in the garden are soaked with the evening rain. Reflected is the cool, clear autumn sky. The owner's dog comes out to greet me. Chrysanthemums bloom along the fence. These people have the same spirit as the ancients. An earthen wall marks their separation from the world. In the house, volumes of poetry are piled on the floor. Abandoning worldliness, I often come to this tranquil place. The spirit here is the spirit of Zen. In the house, volumes of poetry are piled on the floor. I often come to this tranquil place. The spirit here is the spirit of Zen. I read that this morning because I think that's sort of what I hope this time will be, right? Is just a pause into a tranquil place. That the spirit here is the spirit of sort of the collective journey that we're on. That's what I want, right? I would want to do it with you in a space where we're sharing that space physically, but this is the only way we can do it. And so how do we simply tend to each other in this strange digital environment in a way that allows each of us more depth and more insight and more clarity into the journey, so that the spirit of this moment together for the next 20 minutes is the spirit of Zen, or of our own collective spiritual wanderings journey. I'm hoping that you find some of that sense when we hang out, and clearly that you feel like you're collaborating in the journey, right? You're participating by sharing ideas and reflections as we go along, whether they be in real time or even after the fact. It's just so important. All right, so glad you're here in the midst of this. Let me start with part 2 here. Now that we know this is what we're doing together, and I'm in a new platform this morning. I'm using a portal, and so I'm actually able to see your comments. So thanks for all those comments. I'm trying not to read them, but pay attention to what I'm doing today. I want to talk a little bit about an idea that maybe, and let me frame it like this, right? So I'm somebody who's been practicing intentionally and living as a pretty committed religious person for my whole life, but as a professional for many, many years now. And I will tell you that one of the secrets that I have, and I'm going to share this secret with you now, so you could use it if you like, but one of the secrets that I have to how do you keep a kind of a growth edge on your spirituality or your religious practices or your religious perspectives? How do you keep a growth edge when you also are completely dependent on having a strong kind of traditional foundation on which you've built year to date that seems stable enough that it can help you orient to the world, right? So it's this balancing act of having something that you can sort of hang on to or count on or lean on or draw from, given your life circumstances, that has weight and gravitas and tradition and energy behind it. At the same time, if you only have that, it becomes, it will abandon you. It becomes stale. It doesn't work as well. It begins to fray at the edges. It has cracks and fissures within it that don't hold up anymore, and it will dry up. So you need to have as well this kind of growth edge, this leaning edge, a leading edge that helps you continue to let the waters of the living spirit, if you will, the breath of God, if you will, if you want to think of it that way, flow into your religious sensitivities, move through your religious sensitivities so that they're constantly being reinvigorated, refreshed, repurposed, reframed, reimagined with the actual connectivity to some sort of growing edge or living edge. And I think that's what the spiritual life is all about, right? It's not like, you come up with a fix and then that fix works the whole time. It's a constant thing, right? So how do you do that? How do you do both? And one of the ways that I've practiced and is I run things in parallel. And so what I'm going to propose today is an idea that you might want to think about running in parallel. What do I mean by that? It means that I can run it alongside of my current way of orienting in the world, my current spirituality. So whatever spirituality you're practicing right now, you keep that and it functions, but you also start running a parallel edge to that allows you to enter in and explore that idea or that notion or that practice without abandoning what's working for you. But what ends up happening is that as you do, there are pieces of that, or sometimes that whole thing comes in and begins to either refresh, reframe, or sometimes even replace the way in which you are currently finding meaning in the world. Does that make sense? So what it does is it gives you permission to say, I'm not going to just get dogmatic about one way of thinking about my spiritual life or my religious life. I'm going to run pilot projects around the edges of it and see what filters in to this, right? So this is what this is today, a little bit of a pilot project. And the pilot project begins with a lot of scholars who, and I think rightly so, and I totally agree with them. I just got to help figure out how this works, but have seen that the evolutionary trajectory of our understanding of the sacred has been probably since the 1800s somewhere. The sacred or God or our ideas of where God resides have been coming back to earth. They've been coming back to earth. That all the ways in which we construct this idea of God that we have done collectively in various cultures and times and places had a tendency to lift God out from being embedded in the fabric of earth itself and life itself, and then elevated that notion of God to some abstract, to something outside of the system. And so you can see it in our religious practices, right? We pray when I was a little kid, I would pray to God and I would picture God, outside of the system. And I would try to invoke God's favor, or I would seek God's forgiveness, but God was always outside of my realm. And I was wanting God to intervene in some way inside the realm. That was the construct that held my idea of where God resided in the world. But the scholars will tell us that this, if you think about even the trajectory of Christianity, of the Protestant Reformation, of where the world is now, that really what's happening is God is coming back into the world, right? Back into the here and now, back into the present moment, back into the very essence of what life is, the isness of life, the here and nowness of life. And I think that trajectory partly is logical, right? Because here's another sidebar. What time is it? Oh yeah, I got time for sidebar. Here's another sidebar, right? So as a clergy person, I've always tried to push religious communities into new territories, just the thing that I do. And I do notice that as you introduce new ideas, when you move people into new territory, it's a stretch for them, right? And it's a stretch for me. If you ease up on that, they tend to rubber band their way back. It's like pulling a rubber band, right? You push them out here and then they're going to come back to what's most comfortable. You push them out here and they're going to come back to what's more comfortable. We do that as individuals. But if you think about the evolution of religion in general and the rubber band theory that I'm proposing, the same is true for religion. Religions in our species, in our consciousness, its origins are in the natural world, right? How do we relate to this gift of the natural order that, I don't know if it's order, it could be natural chaos that holds us, right? We got to be able to live in harmony with the environment in which we live. That's the earliest forms of kind of religious understanding and perspectives. And it's only as cultures evolved that we moved away from that and then built God into this sort of abstract concept. And if you hold to the rubber band theory, which I do, in some ways we're returning. The trend line's always going to be to pull back to origins of where did this whole thing get started anyway. It got started in the deep relationship to the biosphere and the natural world. God's going to go back there. That's where it all began. That's where it's going to go back to. So that's one idea of this. So I think it's okay to think about this because that's where it all started. It's got some, it's tethered to that. So let's not try to resist it going back there. In fact, scholars will tell you that it's been a trend line that starts probably all the way back into the teachings of Jesus, clearly in the Protestant Reformation, and it's happening today. So what do I mean by that? Don Cupid goes back to a novel written in 1860. You know it well, Tolstoy's War and Peace. And in that novel, Tolstoy has this line, and that is this: to love life is to love God. To love life is to love God. Even if you look, the text for this morning that we're going to be talking about at 11 o'clock is the opening in John's gospel. And John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was this and that, the Word, was forever. But the Word manifests itself. And if you think about the Word is like the breathing capacity of God, that the capacity for God to generate. That capacity is the gift of life itself. And that life is the light that shines for all of us. There is early indication that life itself is the expression of the sacred. In John's gospel, and clearly I think there's a little bit of that in Jesus' teachings as well that we'll explore. This idea that life itself is ultimately the religion of ordinary people like you and me. Your ordinary life, your experience, your sleepless nights is the framework out from which your religious experience is birthed. Ordinary life holds all that is sacred. That if you think of it this way, that the extraordinary is diffused inside of the ordinary, and the ordinary is not something that we're just putting up with, or we're living through, or we're just coping with. The ordinary is the matrix of the spiritual life, right? It matters. It is all that matters, right? It is all that matters. And that's what the scholars are trying to get us to think about, is that how does religion or spirituality play out for you if, in fact, life is God and God is life, and loving life is loving God, and God loves the world that he gives his life for the world, right? We're all in this together kind of idea. That's beautiful, beautiful way of thinking about it. So what might it mean? Clearly, what Don Cupid is describing is that these ideas of kind of religious ideas are really a way to think about God, and maybe if you think about God as supernatural, but the supernatural kind of setting up shop again in our relationship with the world. So let me pause there. You can kind of live with that for a second. Think about that for a moment, and then let's think about what are some of the ramifications for that. I think one of the things that I want to just hint at as we think about are there ways to think about that in relationship to our own spiritual tradition of Christianity, if that's one that you have. Clearly, Jesus was a bit like that, right? They said, hey, Jesus, when is this great kingdom that you're talking about? When does it actually come? We would look into the heavens, we'd figure out, well, what are the signs that tell us this great kingdom's on the way? This great spiritual new day dawning. When's that going to come? Tell us about that. And he says, quit looking for it out there. The kingdom of heaven, Jesus says, is at hand, is in this present moment. So even Jesus too started, reinforce his trajectory. He would not look for the sacred in the traditional holy places like temple or religious purity practices or sacrificial models. He looked for the sacred in fishing villages and the life of the disenfranchised and the people who lived on the margins and your everyday folk. Clearly, there was a sense that all that is sacred can be found in the here and the now, the here and the now of it all. That's a trend line, I think, in Jesus. Now, it's not the strongest trend line, but it's definitely there. The other one, if you're in the Lutheran tradition, is Luther too, right? Broke from a religious model that saw the priesthood as the pure, kind of purity class that was held in monastery and was celibate and apart from the world. And Luther took the priesthood and turned it into, remember, had that line about the priesthood of all believers. Luther got married, had a family, and the priests were like everyday folk like you and me, right? The priesthood became not this class of people pulled out from world, but a class of people in the world in a particular way. And while it, again, is not like the dominant trend line in Protestantism, clearly it's there. These are trend lines that move us into this idea that God is in the fabric of the lived experience that we share. All right, so what does that do for us? I'm just going to do one of the things that it does for us because of time. Because, I know, like a good therapy session, you can hang on for about, 40 minutes at max, but then you got to go. You got to go process. What does that mean for us? I think it helps us move beyond the idea. And I think we have this, that we link our idea of God to an idea of a solution-based notion of salvation or kingdom. That God is there to fix this and make everything all right. Right? You think about how we do that, right? If something goes wrong inside of you, physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, whatever it happens to be, you say, God, can you, make this better? And we use God as a sort of outside entity who is all-knowing, all-present, this abstract notion of God, and we try to get that God to come in and make everything better. And that's all right. I mean, you can do that. You can continue to do that. We all need that kind of sense of hope that's linked to that process. But if you think that God, if you move to this new notion a little bit, and think that God is actually embedded in lifeness, then it's not as if God is trying to actually make everything better or perfect or whatever right is. God exists inside the mess, right? Because life is a mess. And that's why I'm tossing and turning at night, and so are you. Life is messiness. Life holds everything that's absolutely beautiful and horrible all at the same time. Life is absolute bliss and full wretchedness all at the same time. Life is good and life is ill all at the same time. It's all of that. And so you're thinking in terms of, well, if that's the way life is, if God is present in this mess, the mess of all this, then how do I have capacity? Here's the religious question. It's not how do I get out of the mess that is a religious question. It's how do I embrace the mess? And how has the mess and the magic and the craziness and the wonderfulness embraced me? How am I embraced by all of this? And how do I embrace it? how do we hang on to each other, knowing that that then is the most sacred of acts? And when that moment happens for you, this goes back to a little bit of Zen poetry, right? When that moment happens for you, and you imagine that God, in a sense, has returned to the fabric of the here and now, the earth experience, the life experience that we share, when that happens for you, then it's not a matter of you trying to figure it out and make it all better, but to live into it as fully as you can, to be present for it in this moment in time as fully as you can. And there's a different kind of orientation that happens, I think, internally when you think about my spiritual trajectory is linked to my capacity to be present for this, all of this, in a most heartfelt way, in a most soul-focused way. That my freedom or my salvation, salve, right? The healing capacity, that's what salvation is, salve, like Neosporin, right? The healing capacity of my religious experience is my capacity to be embraced by this mess and to embrace this mess with all that, with all that it is. To acknowledge that this life is and holds everything. And I am seamlessly woven into that very gift. I belong here, and I belong in the best relationship I can have with the mess, and that's going to be okay. I mean, that's my way forward. Carl Jung, philosopher Carl Jung, who was Lutheran, by the way, his father was a Lutheran pastor, used to say, salvation is really about achieving a sense of wholeness. It's not fixing everything and making everything all right. It's not like there is an all rightness to all this, even though religions have often sought that trajectory, right? You think about when I was growing up, my idea of religion was when you went to church, you put on your Sunday best, right? Everything, you were on your best behavior. Everything associated with religion was like, a positive thing that you were doing to kind of clean up all of your mess. And Jung would say, no. It's about holding the whole in some way, right? It's about wholeness. It's about being in and with the mess in all that it is, all of life together. That's what Carl Jung would say is actual salvation. All right. So, can you imagine, maybe you could run a parallel process to just wonder as you move into 2021, how is all that you imagine to be sacred and holy present in what we're collectively experiencing? Not that we can somehow seek that God's favor to get us out of this mess, but just to see inside of it that all of its complexity, all of its push and pull, all of its give and take, all of the anxious edges of it and hopeful edges of it, all mixed together, is actually an invitation into your spiritual life, right? That's where it happens. I guess my question is, if you play around with that, will it help you sleep at night? Which is what we're all longing for, right? Will it help you kind of chill out and say, yeah, this is where I am. This is where it is. And we're all in this together, right? The birds that sing, the rivers that flow, the air that moves, the bodies that seek to be connected to each other in beautiful ways. It's all here. This is it. Can I be present for it? Lastly, let me just say, Drew Dellinger, who we've read some of his poetry, I think has made the leap to seeing that the great kind of way in which he frames the religious tradition is to find yourself inside of the story of the universe, right? And that's his way of seeing that God is present, or our old notions of God is present inside of the story of the universe. And so a lot of his poetry, if you bought his book or looked at his book, a lot of his poetry will introduce religious themes inside of his poetic relationship with the cosmic story. I made mention of this in some of our interviews with him, the idea of body and blood, which we think of as a sacrament, present inside the poetry of the natural world. In many ways, it's a little bit like my good buddy Royakan, who, I just lost that poem. I was going to read it to you, and now I lost it. Maybe I can find it. Who finds his way visiting his friend's house and discovers there, in the pile of poetry stacked on the floor, in the dog that comes to greet him, in the trees that wave in the garden, in the chrysanthemums that bloom along the fence, a tranquil place in which the spirit of Zen resides. Can world moment, this moment, in all of its complexity, can it be tranquil place in which the spirit of the sacred resides? That's a darn good question, of which I don't have the answer. But that's what I'm going to explore a little bit as I kind of try to find my way into 2021. And I hope as you journey into 2021, these little moments of reflection that we have together on Sunday morning with some of the, and I'm grateful that you can allow me to be as honest and present as possible, but that we can just kind of pay attention enough to edges of wisdom, insight, that we might engage world in a way that allows us wholeness, togetherness, connectedness, communion, a sense that God is present in it all. Amen to that. All right, all. Thanks for all your comments. I'm looking forward to reading them. I just always can't pay attention to them, but I appreciate you making those comments. Also, if you're not watching this live, but if you're logging on later and watching it, you can pop some comments on there too, and we'll pay attention to them. And then I'll be back here next Sunday at 9:30 live Facebook feed, using either this platform or some other platform to be in conversation with you. Let's journey together into 2021, shall we? It's going to be a wild week, so breathe deep and see if you can't hold both to the traditions that have nurtured you for many, many years that have become your own religious traditions, and maybe new ways of imagining the way God is stirring in the world to keep the edges of your religious journey soft and malleable, a little bit open, so that the spirit of the living God who might be returning back to earth might partner with you in this journey in a meaningful way. All right. Blessings all. See you next Sunday.